That note, allow me to begin. The immune system, I personally think it's the most complicated system that we do in physiology, and there's no way. I really have a course. Here's Dr. Malcolm's course. They're not doing a lab this term, is that correct? You are doing it.
Journal lab.
Okay, so it's not hands-on. Yeah, it's just dry oriented. I don't know that there is a useful lab that we could do here without, because it would be. It's like to do a lab with this, you'd almost have to do animal testing, which is kind of the way we did the physiology aspect of it in medical school. So we were actually, I can recall, and again, it's another one of those that just saddens you because we did so many animal experiments. We were because we're doing it as part of micro. We were actually doing. It was almost like immunization on rabbits, and I mean, X number of rabbits got anaphylactic shock for whatever we were doing. The second go round, like X number of time after the first incident. It's crazy. So I don't think it lends itself terribly well to lab, but it is the most intriguing system because, first of all, it's the classic example. We only notice if something goes wrong. That's the way it works. It's a layered series. It's a layer of immunity, and basically, it's all based on us not having to use the single most important part of the immunity advanced system. It's got 3 layers. 2 external layers and an internal layer. And if we have to activate the internal layer, it's significant business. What's interesting is the interplay between the layers. They reinforce each other by a series of chemical communicators. I mean, it's like levels of security. To talk about it. It's like if you think of a sophisticated security system at your home. Moreover, if you think of it at a military basis, I think it's a better example. You have an external layer that's a hard boundary. Okay, that hard boundary is very, very hard to get through. Whether it's a fence, whether it's some type of mechanical obstruction, whatever it might be. The second, it's reinforced by a second layer of patrolling sentinels. Just like people are on sentry duty. If you're familiar with the military a little bit, sentry duty isn't something to be lazy on. Sentry duty is important. And that's why a lot of problems have been created with people who do not do their job on that. Unfortunately, our white blood cells are on patrol and very alert. That's a whole nother layer. It's based on cellular immunity. Okay? And now if that layer is breached, now they get to what we call, and those are designed, they are pre-programmed to fight invaders. Doesn't matter, they're generalized invaders now, specific invaders. So those are the defenses we employ. We don't even think about it. Like how many times have you said, I feel lousy this morning, I got a cold coming on, and then I'll go to sleep. The next day you wake up and go, I feel a lot better. It must be one of those 24-hour bugs. There is no 24-hour bug. They didn't invent them. You were in an incubatory phase, if you want to call it that, a prodrome phase, an early infection phase of some entity, most likely a virus in that particular scenario, that all of a sudden your body was reacting to by this innate system that we call it, and magically it won. We don't discover it. We just trigger, it's one that 24-hour bug. Oh yeah, that must be that. I hear that's going around. Sure. I mean, we colloquialize it if that's what we're doing. And then subsequent to that, okay, if it crosses that last boundary and gets into, now we've activated a system that responds specifically. And biochemically, it determines that specific response, now to use the word twice, by a series of what we call determinants, which are nothing more than markers. That was what we were going to talk about a little bit today for vis-a-vis blood, but I'll save it. When we do the blood lab, when we talk about transfusions, because the whole idea is this limited markers about the ABO blood grouping. That's the more appropriate way to say it as opposed to blood typing, which includes the RH factor with it. is to understand that it's a series of very simple hexoses, short chains of carbohydrates that effectively protrude from proteins that are the whole basis of this and for most of that. And we formulate our response specifically, particularly in the view of antibodies, without even getting into the really high-powered system of T cells and what they do, to form a response and generate antibodies. And it's a very vigor, it takes over in vast numbers. So there's a lot to this system. I love teaching it. It's very hard to develop good tests. For those that don't know, and again, don't judge me, okay? This particular test, my personal favorite student, when I gave that test in BC3, Butler County Community College, she basically threw the test back at me, having got nearly 100% of every other test, and looked at me, what the hell do you call this? Very that tone. Fortunately, we ended up getting married. Don't judge me, young lady.
It's still kind of long.
Didn't you know that story? Didn't surprise anybody else. Didn't surprise you, did it? See? Some of us are on my game. Because when I tell her giving the immune test, she goes, are you still using that? You pick the adjectives. Hers are fairly graphic. Test to those poor students. You blank blank. Terms of endearment in our household. See what you have to look forward to? Aren't you excited? And she's over, you're over the top with Jordan. Enough of the introductory stuff. Here's the system. It's a concept. We'll look at the players in the system. We've got some cells, we have some chemicals. The chemicals are important. The hard part, teaching-wise, it's a purely physiological system for nearly entirely. And understanding the activation of these is complex. So I don't know what you're doing with regard, particularly to T cell activation, co-stimulation, and things like that. Is that anything that anybody taking? Have you got anywhere near that in immunology yet? Co-stimulation, killer T cells, cytotoxic T cells. Other than that,
Discuss the last year.
yeah, I mean, so you start to see stuff like that. I don't want to enable anybody's extension ever. He wants you to enable it. I don't want to enable it. I'm not into it. Moving on. First and second lines of defense. They're intrinsic. We have them. The problem is when they're not there or they're violated. So the first line of defense, external. Skin, number one barrier. Anything. First thing, maybe I told you that when we did the skin unit back in anatomy. They did skin inspection. You were going to scrub in that day, and every surgical resident, all they want to do is cut. Before you were allowed to go in the OR, you had to show them your hands, okay, to make sure there weren't cuts or anything on it. Because in one, it potentially would expose you, at least important, more importantly, statistically, you're more likely to expose, even if you were scrubbing and putting on gloves, to expose the patient to a post-operative infection. So we did hand check. You were so super careful. You know, it wasn't like you were cognizant if you went out to play sports or anything like that. I mean, my typical sports, I play golf, is not really great. Hey, get paid a lot if I was any good. First and second lines of defense. The first line, skin, and the moist linings, that's what mucosa is. So mucous membranes, all those, the vast majority of them on the entries are all stratified squamous, non-keratinizing, and then and your digestive tract, really, a little bit of respiratory, but mostly digestive, simple columnar with goblet cells, and respiratory just slightly different, with pseudostratified, ciliated columnar with goblet cells. That's what it is. So the moist linings are moist because of fluids and because of mucus, and that's the protective nature of it. And they're remarkably protective. If you get through those, you have a variety of chemical agents, you have cells, And you have a variety, and the single most important thing that they generate is inflammation. Because inflammation is your body's systemic response. When you don't get inflammation, immediately tells you something. Remember, from a clinical perspective, whether it's happening whether you're a doctor or in a healthcare field, or whether you're a parent or you're anybody, if it's supposed to get inflamed and it doesn't, it tells you there's a problem. If it's not doing what it's supposed to do, even if it's supposed to bleed like crazy and it doesn't, it tells you there's a problem. Whether it doesn't stop bleeding, whether it doesn't start bleeding, whether it doesn't become inflamed, whether it does swell up or doesn't swell up, all of those things. The absence of the thing is as important as the presence of the thing when you're expecting it. And so under that, and then if it's able to avoid these and somehow escape, which is an intricate challenge. Now we're dealing with something here. And yes, it takes longer to react than the innate, but oh boy, two good things about it. When it reacts aggressively and viciously under normal circumstances, number one. And number two, it remembers. Immunological. So what happens in this system, how do we have any memory in this system? Just like I would be talking about to you now, talking about the ABO system, we make antibodies. We're genetically pre-programmed to make antibodies based on our own familial genetic history, which is adapted to, or what has become adapted to by where we reside over a long term, things like that. And it's demonstrated because with blood typing. If you're like me, type A, you make antibodies to B. If you have type B, you make antibodies to A. If you have AB, you don't make them. If you have O, you make antibodies to both. We're pre-programmed to make certain kinds of antibodies. That's part of this system, antimicrobial protein. So, it's a very significant player, because I tell the anecdote about a doctor and a nurse who should have been smarter, taking their 10-month-old to visit their really close friends down in San Antonio and party for New Year, and we're talking about my eldest, and ending up after a long, hard battle to be able to secure an adoption. The adoption of relative very, very smoothly, actually. And you really lost him to something called rotavirus, which is infantile diarrhea virus, which is rare here, was rare at the time, back in 1983, 84, and indigenous, always present. One of the things we talk about, herd immunity, where you have 90% of the population or more have been exposed to it and already generate antibodies to it. We bring the kid down there, and then having to do a workup for bacterial meningitis, had to be in the hospital for 10 days. Not a great vacation. Santa Rosa Children's Medical Center in wonderful San Antonio. So it was a 7-day hospitalization. How's that? You know who pulled the night shift? So he's in 2 weeks, he can give you a hard time on purpose. So it's a functional system, Physiology 101. They're intertwined. The interesting part about this system is when one's violated, it sends signals to the other one going, hey, we got a problem. It's like one of those ring systems or whatever systems you do, a blink system you have. You know when somebody's there. How clever. Our body's got that system. Moreover, if it activates that attacking system with adaptive immunity, what does it do? It sends information to the innate system and goes, you idiots, you let something get in. Harden up your boundaries. Put out more soldiers. That's the way I think of it. To understand the layers that are there in the interaction. When we get to the adaptive, and most of it's done through helper T cells. And their name says it all. It's their secretions, their basically production of a variety of powerful chemical agents, which I'm sure you talked about a little if you're having immunology, called interleukins, and particularly IL-2. Basically, it's the linchpin for a lot of these things. Get into all that. We'll get into the pharmaceuticals that are now being made, whether it's for good or for bad, that are all about these agents, of which I have taken a couple. that we now make genetically. They have their issues. So I was on both, initially on Cosentyx and subsequently on Humira to treat my aggressive immunological arthritis, which I no longer have effectively symptoms. My shoulders hurt all the time. And I digress. So they both release and recognize a lot of the same molecules. The innate defenses have specific pathways depending on what it is. The innate responses release proteins that alert cells of the adapter. Hey, we got an invader. It's like sounding the alarm. Love that. So what's in there? Skin, mucous membranes, internal defenses, white blood cells, phagocytic blood cells, ones that act very much like T and B cells, particularly T cells, okay? Natural killer cells. Already, I like a cell like that. It's not putting up with any. Yeah, I know. I was going to say another one of those words. NK cell, inflammation, generalized response. Fever is a generalized response of inflammation body-wise. Antimicrobial proteins and the aforementioned fever, and now we got the adaptogens. Which are your cake. All about attacking disease-causing organisms, and depending on how they are, the attacks are mounted differently. And really, if there's one principal area to be familiar with are the two arms. Really, it's a difference because when we use T cells versus B cells. B cells could be from the bone marrow. Another good term that they use is RE antibodies, because that's what they generate. Okay? So you can remember it either way. T cells are specifically about the cell, and the whole distinction, with limited exceptions, is what? Why do we make antibodies as opposed to generating T cells? Pardon me? Right, well, these are from adapter, okay, which is true.
Probably takes less chemical building blocks to make it.
Well, I mean, you might be actually correct, but it's not exactly why we generate one and not the other. So I was curious if you're taking, if they got into that thing. It's all about what it does. If it's on a cell, so there's a difference between A and cell. If it's sitting on a cell, on cell surface, if it's in fluids or secretions, if it's free floating in the bloodstream, okay, basically those are, and the vast majority of things that we encounter, the common cold, the flu, COVID, okay, by and large, we're not talking about the severity, we're talking about the way it interacts with. What that generates, that is a non-cellular immunity. It has not ordered markers on the cells. Did you look at the MHC1s and 2s and things like that? The question is whether or not it's just on top of a cell, floating around in fluid in the bloodstream, okay, on the surface of anything, or whether or not it has done something to the cell. It's either in the cell, okay, it's altered the cell, okay, it's a cancer cell, which by definition is foreign, it's a transplanted or transfused cell. So the difference between one is humoral, traveling within the plasma effectively, and the other is cellularly based. So when you get that cold, you generated antibodies. One of the most successful treatments for COVID, same deal, was monoclonal antibodies. They were specifically targeted by antibodies. It's different. When you talk about cellular immunity, that's totally different. You're generating T cells for tuberculosis because it's altering the markers on the cell. So we get into these different types of what markers it alters and why we respond to them. This is the basis of the whole system. It doesn't make one arm any less effective or more effective. It's just why they're called, why they're called into action, series of markers. And the cells don't know whether it's COVID or just, I got a cold. I've got an enteric virus. That, they just know how they respond to it by the markers. And really, that's the whole system. It's nothing but altering markers, surface markers, and certain cells adhere to it, and it stimulates a particular response. And they'll have names, and we'll go into all the names. Oh my God, so. That's the intricacy, that's the difficulty. I'm gonna have, and generally in this term, this will help you. I don't go overboard. Because a lot of students have immunology, so I don't go crazy. Even if you're not taking it, you benefit by not taking it. So I love this, I mean, I really do. And I mean, part of what's behind it is I have an immunological disorder. We talk about immunological disorders. We talk about rheumatoid arthritis. We talk about lupus. We talk about all of those kinds of things that are MS, because those are immunologically based disorders. We at least classify them in a family of autoimmune disorders at this point in time. And that has changed over the years that I have studied this and worked with patients that were just, approaching the big 50 mark. You're going to be a great grandfather, I suppose you have to admit. But we tell Hannah she's thinking about dating a great grandfather. I give her a hard time. She stunned me. Even she doesn't. And I like her. Okay, mucin, sticky, defensives. Just what their name suggests, they're a defensive agent that's useful. Other chemicals, lipids, dermacidin and sweat, they're toxic to certain bacteria. There's so many of these little things. I just have to recall all those names. Nose hairs. Okay. There's a limited amount of things that can get through. It's a certain size. Back after 9/11, you may or may not recall that there was a domestic terrorism incident where somebody disgruntled in a lab that was working with anthrax had basically, you're basically chemically manipulating them and weaponizing them. Anthrax are an endospore. The normal endospore of anthrax are too large to get through. The only times they can get through your nose is if you're just exposed constantly and there's a certain amount of variation. So for years, the people who were exposed to anthrax get sick, and they didn't get cuts on their hands, which is much more common, before they wore all sorts of protective, it was respiratory. It was called wool sorters disease, because they're shearing the sheep. I mean, imagine what it was like, 150 years ago with sheep herders. Okay, you're just, you're carrying it, there's all that, we didn't know how it was transmitted. They get it on their hands because they didn't wear protective equipment, they inhale it. So what he did was I think it was a man, out in Iowa, as I recall, weaponized this by chemically milling down the anthrax to make the endospore, the outer coat, smaller, less diameter, so it would get through. And people opened these letters, and this powder came out, and they inadvertently inhaled it. It was kind of scattered in the air, and a couple people died. And we thought after 9/11 that, oh my God, now we're having bioterrorism. From foreign-based bioterrorism, it turned out to be domestic. And they isolated because they could identify the strain. But it had to come from that lab, and process it. They figured out who did it. So, but by and large, they're our buddies. In the cilia, they sweep it out. If it's in your nose, they go to your mouth. If it's in your throat, they go to your mouth. If it's in your mouth, they go back to your throat, towards your mouth, until you can expel it, get rid of it one way or the other. And all of these, if it does happen to get through, if you inadvertently do something, you have a second line of defense that takes over. So these are just things. The barriers are biological, chemical, and physical. Skin's strong, tough. It's tough to cut your skin. It really is. Comparatively speaking, how many times have you just got something sharp and go, I thought I would cut myself? It's not easy to do, comparatively. If you didn't know, you do a lot more damage with a dull blade than with a sharp blade. You're going to cut yourself with a sharp blade. That's why most kitchen incidents are what we call non-tetanus prone wounds. They're much less likely to be problematic. They just are. So it's the regular ones that are not. So that's part, just, go ahead.
Does soap take off the acid?
Sometimes it does have to be cautious. It's a wonderful point. It's the fact that, where is it? There's gotta be one in here. I'm looking for the oh. Is that a dispenser underneath that paper towel thing for like, hand sanitizer? That stuff's killing. These people who are obsessive hand sanitizers are destroying themselves. I mean, I'm not objecting to it. Use as much as you want. Use a moisturizer. It's your skin. If you overhand wash, and they can't leave one of those things without using it. Every room you get into. How many times I have to tell you, we put our hands inside of people, we didn't wear gloves until 1994 in the emergency. I mean, we didn't do it in the chemistry lab. We didn't have an apron. We didn't have goggles. Somehow I've made it through this law, despite smoking, 2 packs a day for 40 years and all the other stuff I exposed myself to. Please. Tougher. You all are. But then it destroys your hand. And that's your basic protection against disease. So that's part of it.
What about like showering at night?
It depends on how, yeah. We do tend to overshow.
That's what I was wondering.
And we always tend to overshow. We go nuts for it. It's hard because it's cultural.
Yeah.
You think, oh my God, I worked out. Normally you work out, you want to shower, but not everybody does that. It depends on the nature of your relationship. I'm trying not to sound inappropriate, but I have a difficult time doing that. If you're going to have an intimate moment, I suspect you would want to shower. I think circumstances would dictate that more than anything else. We're obsessed with that. So it's like, oh my God. For years, people, they used to joke about folks in France who would shower once a week. Really? So sometimes, I remember there's little things like water availability which play a role in it. The nature of our society is different than other societies. We've been masking odors for years with scents. That can be problematic as well. Yeah, short story, the showering can be, and so if you're like that, we have there's a lot of good skincare products around today. And if your skin has a tendency to get dry, you should be aware of that. There's a lot of moisturizers that can be used. So I think if you're insistent on doing it as frequently as many people are, in the old days, we get the old Dial soap out, and oh my God, the better it smells, the worse it is for your skin. The better it lathers up, the worse it is for your skin. For somehow my folks knew that. We were a Dove household for forever. And that's a relatively mild soap. And laundry detergents in the same area. They gotta be, for the kids, we were very, I agree, I had a big rep, not nearly as good as some other folks. Now we're a little bit more cognizant. About skin, I know something. I used to treat skin problems. So all of that. So, and the other things that are there that are protective, the chemical basis of it. So it's mechanical, it's chemical, okay? Because of whether it's salty from perspiration, it's evaporated. The oils themselves are there that we don't want to denude necessarily, a la soap and water. The bacteria don't love them. They don't like the saltiness. There's all the other chemicals that are there naturally occurring as part of the immune system. What we call the acid mantle, because the cells break down, phospholipid bilayer, right? What happens? It exposes them. The acidity is in there. It's a good thing. And so you're looking at the physical nature and the biologically, what is our skin covered with? Microorganisms everywhere. 100% of our skin is covered 100% of the time with microorganisms. No matter how often these folks shower and use that, it's coming right back in. Get over it. You're covered in bugs. But they're your friends because they're covering up, they're using resources, they're covering receptor sites, and we're constantly sampling the environment. That's the hygiene hypothesis. That's why, because other things, they're coming out, if you didn't see the original first season of something called Wolf Hall. It was a brilliant series on Masterpiece Theater. Not a lot of action. Mark Rylance was probably the best Shakespearean actor around, doing a show about Henry VIII, going through numbers of wives. And focused on a lady, Hilary Mantel, who died relatively recently, kind of young, who was very intrigued by Thomas Cromwell, the character that facilitated Henry VIII getting rid of wives and acquiring wives. But you know, it goes around, comes around. The second season is coming up, but his whole idea was he wanted a male heir. And the lady who gave him the male heir died immediately after childbirth. Immediately. And that child he became king for like a month, less than a year, because they kept him isolated. They didn't let him go out with all the other kids. Yeah, all that. They scrubbed down the walls 3 times a day with lye or other solutions. They wouldn't let him be with any other kids. He didn't. It's like our parents sent us out, go play, get dirty. I don't want to see it. They weren't worried about people snatching kids as we are today. Yeah, I think they're proportionally certainly less visible predators than we're there today. And then you come back in, it's like, oh, you're a mess. Throw yourself, get cleaned up or you can't have dinner, which resonated with me. Did you like that one? So, I don't think you weighed 260 when you were in high school. 6 of you probably didn't weigh that. Nevertheless, all of these, so you have a variety of mechanisms, physical, chemical, and biological, as well as we see a physical nature. Even the lining is not that terribly delicate, and there's multiple layers. Stratified protection. This is why I try to link this. I hope you understand. I know I'm droning on. I should be shut up soon. I will. So the innate system, the cells, basically on patrol. We have white blood cells, like the neutrophils I was telling you about, are out there on patrol. Okay, these NK cells are basically lymphocytes, and they have macrophages. And all of them have, with the exception of the lymphocytes, have phagocytic capabilities. They're on there generically, they're pre-programmed. Anything that they don't recognize, they do what they do. Okay, and by and large, if it's ones that are free-floating, which most of them are at that point in time, what do they do with them? They immobilize. They target them. They neutralize them in some way, shape, or form. Slow them down, expose them, and macrophages come along and go, lunch. Effectively what they do. The lymphocytes are a little bit differently. The NK cells, they will destroy them, but there's residue left over, and then the macrophage come over and clean up the mess. That's there. And you see that, and it mirrors what they do when we're talking about T cells and B cells. When antibodies work that way, and T cells work that way, except on a more sophisticated level, and what this system is in the innate is very non-specific. If you're not recognized, you're in trouble. But it's a generalized effect. Okay, and we're going to see the over-the-top responses as it gets through. So all of these cells are there. There are even interferons that are produced. Cells produce those. If you're invaded by a virus, many cells will produce something called an interferon. Are you familiar with those? Just yes or no? Okay. So what do? There's different kinds of interferons. And this one sort of generically tells other cells, there's a virus, I just got attacked. Lock your doors. It's like one of those warnings. There's a loose convict or anything, lock your doors, blah, blah, blah. It's what it is. Please do. Don't make fun of it. You should listen to that. If they're telling you to lock your doors, lock your doors. We live in where we didn't used to lock our door ever. And then managed to get my stepdaughter's purse snatched. person was in the house when we got back. No. My wife and I were asleep in the master bedroom. She and two of the other kids were still living with us in college at the time. And all of a sudden, I hear the dogs in bed, our old dog. Surprised he didn't show up. Not a bark. He'd bark at anything else, but sleep in the bedroom, no work. Come outside, somebody's in the house, grabbed her purse, took off. Eventually the cops found this person. I mean, there was some degree of restitution when they finally arrested her. The drug seeker, money for drug seeking. And the dog, you're not doing your job. Anybody else would walk in the front door, be a barkathon. No, we're in bed. I'm off duty. I'm asleep. You guys are asleep. I'm asleep. Not this dog, man. It's huge. It's scared to death. See if I jump on it. Yeah. So, antimicrobial proteins, interferons are like that. Complement is activated. We'll move it to complement cascade. And fever. Fever ups the ante and increases things. And this is what I'm talking about, pattern recognitions. They recognize and bind tightly the structures on microbes so they can't do what they do. They're, again, pre-oriented to certain patterns to avoid. That's what I mean, where there's a pre-programming element. Just like making antibodies. And it's probably why my oldest got so sick at that time. It's very scary. Very, very scary. You're 2,000 miles away, and very big from your pediatrician, etc. These toll-like receptors, we have 11 different categories, and we have a response that's very sophisticated without going crazy. White cells, neutrophils, the most abundant, they die fighting, but when they're exposed, they attack. And then again, that's where pus comes from. Macrophages from monocytes, they're ones that are scavenging, wandering around. Classic example in the lung, you might remember alveolar macrophages. We slough like millions of them, coughing them up every day. We make tons. It's like that. It's like a Roomba. Remember how it was the room to sweep it out? Yeah. My poor dog would kill it. We'd go nuts. We'd never get minutes sleep. Okay. And you can see there are ones that are permanent resident colonies. And there's some example. That's what they look like. Okay, so here you can see, I mean, actual micrograph 2,000 times. There's bacteria. It's going to latch onto it, grab it, and bring it in. It is brilliant. I mean, and we have known about it. We've seen this. It's interesting. There was a movie, I think I told you, won an Academy Award back in like '64. The Disney people did called, I don't know. That's it. Either Impossible Voyage or something. Fantastic. You know, one of the first things I saw the late Rachel Welch. Well, I mean, they were actually trying to, it was like sci-fi, how they could shrink people to go in and dissolve a blood clot. But it showed how white blood cells attacking, and boy, they attack just that way. So they had a pretty good idea even back then, well, these 60 years ago, how that happened. So you'll probably find, I mean, you surely can find that on YouTube. It's dated, but it's kind of fun. Okay. So again, carbohydrate patterns, process starts, capsules, help them evade it. Capsules, if you learned about it in micro, they resist phagocytosis. And respiratory, it's almost tuberculosis, streptococcal pneumonia, that's pathogenic. Capsules, they're encapsulated. And what do? They coat them. They use antibodies or complement proteins called opsonins. They coat them. Yeah, they're handles. They're latch onto for phagocytosis. You know what opsonization literally means? I don't know. What does it mean?
I know what it means in my head. I don't know how to put it into words.
Oh, I love this. Make tasty. To make tasty. Whenever I think of that, you know what I think of? Spoonful of sugar. Mary Poppins. It's not chim chimney, chim chimney, chim chim chiree, but what is? No context for this? Did you ever go, did you watch movies when you were little? Wizard of Oz, I'm sure was in there. Sound of Music? You didn't like that? I don't blame you. Those kids start singing, first two choruses of Edelweiss, I'm rooting for the Nazis.
Well, no, it's not.
It's a joke, it's a joke. It's a comedy routine. You're so sick and tired of kids by that time. That's what it means. It's a comedy routine by one of my favorite comics. He's talking about who can't stand it when they redid it on TV. You know, all that type of stuff. When they redid some of those things. And those kids start singing, oh my God, I'm ready for the Nazis. You're up in the mountains, you can't miss them, they're always singing. It's a very funny routine. The comic's name is Rob Bartlett, and he is very clever with voices. Believe me, I'm Jewish, I'm not rooting for any Nazis. It's a joke. But for the movie, yeah, because they used to show it every year. You didn't have streaming. You see it all the time. And that's Mary Poppins was one of those movies. Very famous. It came out in the 50s. My sister read it. She's old. And it's just, and a lot of kids of my age, the baby boomers, that's how we acquainted with it. And Walt Disney went out and bought the rights from a lady named P.J. Travers, because men didn't write so much, you had to use initials. It's like To Kill a Mockingbird. You know, Harper Lee was the first name's Kate. Oh my God, women write that. You understand that's what went around back then. It's true. So, you know, phagocytosis, we're almost done. Well, yeah, phagosome, phagolysosome, not doing it again, why bother? Okay. And this is the idea. This one lives in a, that's what's so dangerous about tuberculosis, it lives inside a macrophage. So what happens, you have a thing called a respiratory burst, okay? Now this is the way most of the time it works, it's tougher with tuberculosis, okay? Kills pathogens to resist lysis, so it releases toxic derivatives of oxygen. That's meant by respiratory burst, because we get them because we aerobically respire, okay? And all of those chemical things. And the neutrophils also help by piercing it. That's the great thing. They shoot little, remember we talked about that in lecture. Defensive, short little weapons into the air, penetrate it, and then those respiratory bursts, those enzymes work delightfully. The lymphocytes are phagocytic, cancer, and infected cells before the adaptive. So most of those are the natural killer cells are lymphocytes that act like T cells. That's the idea of cell-mediated immunity. That's really the important part about understanding this. And then you don't have the self-receptors, they induce apoptosis, they secrete chemicals that enhance the inflammatory response. We'll get to that, almost done. Inflammation, whenever the body is injured. Anything. Also, when you're infected and certain chemicals are received, we call pyrogens. So what does inflammation do? First of all, chemical signals. Prevents the spread of damaging agents, disposes of debris, alerts the adaptive system, sets the stage for repair. All of it's true, because there's a whole set of things that work when something becomes inflamed. So this is too important for me to, so call it a day. I appreciate your staying. I apologize for this. But we're good. You can see you're getting antsy. 2.